If I can bring the committee back to order, as it's 9:25. The next item on our agenda is the report back from the Cabinet member around SIL that we called in, and there were recommendations, and you answered our recommendations, but we've obviously got questions for you, so if you'd like to come forward, Johnson.
Yeah.
Right, okay, so we had three recommendations. If you could go through them one by one and expand on them, and if we've got questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I fully appreciate this is a setup having to go after my dynamic colleague, Councillor Jasmine Ali. One thing I'll say is, fully appreciate the process this has gone through and recognise that this has helped in terms of sharpening up the process and ensuring we get the best possible outcome. So I'll quickly run through what's guided both the responses to recommendations, and then also talk a bit about next steps and talk a bit about what this response isn't as well. Since the discussion we had some months ago, there has been continued engagement. So I know Alice has met with a number of community groups. I've personally met with chairs of community councils as well. And we've continued to look at how we ensure we reflect on the recommendations that were put forward by Overview and Scrutiny. So I'll quickly run through the recommendations and the responses. The first recommendation talked about ensuring that the lists are checked with community councils to identify potential discrepancies. That process has begun. I should be open and honest, that process hasn't come to a conclusion, mostly because of timing of meetings and timing of diary clashes, but that work will continue. I'm happy to report back on a further report, whether written, or happy to come back again in terms of giving a further update once that work is completed. The second recommendation talked about the eligibility for neighbourhood SIL, local SIL, and highlighted the fact that it was overly onerous and essentially, I believe the word that was used was, it looked like it was intended to mitigate the impact of, it looked like it was intended to just plug holes in the council budget. In response to that, we've recognised that, and we've said all along actually, since the beginning of this process, that the neighbourhood SIL and local SIL is very much that, and in terms of developing an open and transparent process, we will ensure that SIL is as much as possible spent in the area that is generated, and ensuring that the criteria, whilst it's open and honest and transparent, it also recognises addressing the need of inequality and also addressing local need across the piece. So we've been clear in the response that whilst we would expect it to relate to a council objective, we will not have any undue onerous criteria on it as well. And then the final recommendation talked about, well, it's the final two, but the recommendation number 3 talked about the neighbourhood portion of SIL should be spent in the ward or locality in which has been collected. Both in reflection onto the conversations we've had with community groups and also conversations we've had with community council chairs, we've recognised very much the feedback we've received is that it's important that local SIL is spent in an area that it is generated. But we also heard, in fact, from the very conversation we had at OSC here last time, was that where that area and how that area is defined needs to have a level of flexibility, because we heard from a number of councillors in Camberwell, who potentially put forward the idea of a couple of wards coming together if around the town centre, because that would make sense for them. Others, that might not necessarily be practical, and it might be more of a smaller geographical area. So having that flexibility moving forward will be important in terms of shaping the proposals that ultimately come to Cabinet. What this isn't in terms of a response, this is not the final proposals moving forward. It's very much responding to the recommendations and responding to the points put forward by Overview and Scrutiny. The Cabinet paper that went to Cabinet in December highlighted community investment plans to come back to Cabinet in April. Now, to ensure that we're having the right conversations and that process as detailed and transparent as possible, we are committing that that paper will now come back to Cabinet in May / early June, but ensuring that we are making these decisions in a timely fashion. The final recommendation highlighted was in respect to listing the number of organisations and the projects that had been approved at the Cabinet paper in December. And if you look at behind the paper that was sent to circulated to OSC, that also highlights those projects that were approved by Cabinet and has been reflected as well. So where does that leave us? We are, in terms of the timeline, as I said, there'll be a Cabinet paper detailing the approach to community development plans in terms of both geographical boundaries and also how we go about selecting the themes and the criteria, and that will be coming to Cabinet in May, June, May, at the earliest opportunity in the next municipal year. In terms of what that looks like is that when that paper comes forward, we would expect a period of engagement, continuing that approach that we've set out right from the beginning and right from the start of this process when we started looking at how we ensure that we develop and relook at SIL moving forward. I'll end on 2 quick points. 2 things have become apparent. The recommendations that have come forward from OSC previously have highlighted some questions, and I'm happy to have a discussion about the response to those questions. But it's also highlighted that the process of Section 106 and SIL more generally there is an opportunity to relook at how that is collected. So if you look at the SPD that guides the Section 106 and SIL collection, this was developed in 2015. Now, our local economy is in a different place to where it was in 2015. So having an opportunity to reflect on a Section 106 and SIL through an SPD, that's something we will start work on in the autumn, leading on to early next year as well. But that's for the SPD. That's not necessarily in terms of how it's spent, it's how it's generated. And then the final thing I would like to highlight is, I know, through the process of this discussion and through the process over the last few months, one thing I've often heard is that, why don't we just get on and spend the money? And one thing that I always reflect on this is that if we do get this right, this is a really good opportunity to ensure that we're working with communities to develop the social infrastructure and the community infrastructures that we all want to see right up and down the borough. So, I appreciate there are going to be different views and there's going to be a discussion as to how we get the right outcome. But when we do get that outcome, this is a really good opportunity and a great opportunity to showcase our work with the community.
Okay, I know Hamara wants to speak, and Victor, and then I'll come in towards the end. Hamara?
Thank you very much for the response. I think certainly thank you very much for the response. When we raised the call in early in the year, we definitely had concerns about locality of spend. So I was very grateful to have your answers. I've got a couple of questions on the answers, but I do want to start with a slight frustration. On recommendation 1, I don't understand why it's taking so long to get a bunch of community council chairs around the table to validate lists, which is effectively what we were asking, and it's a couple of months later and this hasn't completed. So I'll ask all of my things together. I mean, it really shouldn't be that hard. On recommendation 2, you've put, it is proposed that the community investment plans will be based on clear, unambiguous and locally agreed sets of criteria. What do you mean by locally, please? And then on recommendation 3, whilst I don't feel like you've really answered it, I feel like you're still straddling a fence around, how local is local. We'd already said should be spent in the ward or locality, appreciating that localities straddle ward boundaries, because ward boundaries are just a political way of carving up people for voting purposes. But in here you've written community investment plans will be developed in an open, transparent way, taking account of local needs and aspirations while recognising the inequalities across the borough. So what do you mean by that? Because it sounds like you're actually trying to stretch what that locality boundary might be again, and it would be very disappointing if money isn't spent in the area that it was generated. Thank you.
So I'll reflect on the first question. First, it's equally frustrating that we are not moving at, and I share that frustration. It's equally frustrating that we're not moving at a pace that we would all like. And I think we can all share that if we were in a position to be able to ensure that we're spending the money as soon as possible, working with local communities in an open, transparent way, we would do that. But it is important that we get the process right. And if it means that we are taking a little bit more time to get the process right, then I much will prefer to get the process right and ensure that it stands the test of time. I'll leave Alice to come back in respect of the precise detail of developing the work that's in terms of overlooking the project lists that have been developed for the cabinet paper. In terms of the other questions you've pointed to, what does locally agreed means? I think that's why I've been clear at the beginning of this discussion, is that in terms of this response, this is not detailing what the final proposal will be. This is responding to the recommendations put forward. What we are clear about is that when we do determine what locally means, it will be in line with what we've said in the responses, which is ensuring that it is flexible enough to reflect that a number of wards may want to come together, but also recognising that it is reflective of where that, as much as possible, where that seal has been generated.
And the last person.
And the last point in respect of question 3, again, I just going to reflect the point that you're saying in terms of reflecting inequality. We've always said in a cabinet paper, and is not to try and widen out the area. We've always said that part of local seal is ensuring that it addresses the added pressure that development brings, and that's the ultimate the test of inequality, which is ensuring that people have access to good quality schools, ensuring that people have access to good quality health centres. So when we say addressing inequality, that's inequality right across the borough, because we see inequalities right across the borough. So it's not trying to dilute the definition of a locality, because I've been quite clear from the beginning of this discussion that we are not detailing what the future proposal will be. What we are saying is that when the proposals come forward, it will need to address inequalities as well.
In which case, when will we see your final proposals?
And that's why I've been quite clear from the outset. I'm happy to come back to overview and scrutiny before it goes back to Cabinet in May. Happy to do so.
I suggest that we discuss that as the last item under the work programme, that we ensure we have it in our work programme for the next municipal year.
Thank you.
Yeah. Victor.
I suppose on that, I'm sort of slightly concerned if maybe this has come too soon, because it doesn't really seem as if anything's substantially moved on since when we last brought this to OSC. And we can't really do a pre-decision scrutiny session, as this paper suggests, if we don't actually know what the meat is on the bone, so to speak. And so I think it's frustrating, because I think I know there's a lot of people that are really concerned about this whole process taking so long. They want to have a clear idea about when it might be resolved. So I mean, perhaps you can elaborate on when you think, once it does reach Cabinet, if that's in the summer, how long it will take for the new regime to be set up and in place. In the meantime, I know there are a number of local residents groups that were keen to come and speak this evening, and due to other commitments and the time, they're not able to. But there is millions of pounds sat in a bank account at the moment from what's already been collected from neighbourhood sale. So I suppose residents are keen to know why it's taking so long for this money to be spent, and can they have an assurance that this has not already been allocated for other priorities or actually spent. And then I'd be grateful if you could elaborate on a couple of specific points about how the Cabinet report will look to, so building on sort of what Amira was just saying around how communities are going to be, how they're going to be involved in prioritising projects and category, and the categories in their local area. And then also how the Cabinet report is going to address the point, the commitment the leader made, that still will be spent in ward-specific areas. It seems to me that we have a very good opportunity with the new ward boundaries, which were independently drawn up to be the basis. Where we do have neighbourhood plans or conservation areas, that seems like a good opportunity to ensure that they are the sub-boundaries within the ward that maybe are more appropriate. But these are all issues that it's hard for us to actually scrutinise as a committee when we don't really have enough to really go into depth.
Can I come back? I'll come back on all of the points, and Alice, feel free to come in if I've missed anything. In respect of pre-decision scrutiny and whether this has been worth, whether it was worth coming back at this time, I will say, whilst I acknowledge and I recognise that this is not the final proposal, we have had the opportunity today to reflect on the recommendations and to respond to those recommendations. And I have detailed what the next steps will be in terms of when it will be going to Cabinet, and also detailed what the next steps will be after that. So I appreciate and I acknowledge that this is not the final proposal moving forward, and I can see why that will be frustrated. But in respect of whether this is a good use of time, we've been able to reflect on the recommendations that came forward from the previous discussion and been able to respond. So again, any outcomes that come from today's discussion, again, I'll be able to take that forward and reflect on it as well. In terms of money to be spent and money that's already sitting in the bank, we've been absolutely clear from the beginning that local still is local still, and we won't be. This hasn't been spent in terms of apart from the cabinet decision that was taken in December that looked at the specific projects that we discussed previously, and we'll be absolutely open and transparent with that moving forward. In terms of discussions we've had with communities, I continue to have those discussions. You talk about community groups. I know we just had Backside Open Space Trust here earlier, and we've fully engaged with a number of organisations right across the borough, and will continue to do so, because as you quite rightly say, they want to see these projects be delivered as soon as possible, and we share that priority. But we do need to ensure we get the process right. Let's reflect on what where we found ourselves in May 2018, and it's not it's fair to say that we had a process where there was differing and varying understanding of what that process was, and it was important to ensure that we had a process moving forward that was transparent and open. And again, I can always share frustration in terms of we haven't been able to get to that point at a quicker stage, but it's important we get that process right.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Johnson. The only thing that I just think it's important for anyone that's watching this or wants to find out from today is about when this new SIL regime will be in place, and I think we haven't yet had a clear enough indication about when that's likely to be.
Could I just add something to Councillor Sittu's answer? He shares your frustration because he's inherited this. The project banks were just an evolution from a Section 106 thing that worked quite well, and it's never really been properly installed, adapted, etc. The other thing we are trying to do is we haven't actually got a system where we monitor this particularly well. The planning system doesn't have a kind of SIL button anywhere, so we've been kind of like muddling along, and we've started installing, well, it's been about a year now, installing a new software system that will monitor and manage the billing of SIL, the collection of SIL, and the spending of SIL. So we're going to have a complete system, and it will have a public-facing module. So if it will be totally transparent to what we collect, what we bill people, what people are liable, and where it's spent. So we're working on that, but unfortunately, you all know our IT systems. It's taking somewhat longer than we'd hoped. We hope to be live in September. The other slight issue we've got is all our records to date have been on the old ward boundaries, and we haven't actually managed to change that yet geographically to the new ward boundaries. So, we're having issues there. So as I say, Johnson's Councillor Situ's actually inherited a lot of this rather than being the cause of, and hence his frustration.
But you know, absolutely clear in terms of you know your point, Victor. If you're a community group, you're a member of public, local resident, what can you look forward to in terms of timeline? Cabinet paper going into as soon as possible after this in the next municipal year. From that process, the engagement starts almost immediately. So in terms of timeline, I you know, that's as clear as I can be, and that's clear in terms of next steps and what happens after that cabinet paper.
I'm going to forgo my questions because they were asked by both Amira and Victor, but I am going to register my annoyance on the excuse around ward boundaries. We're now entering year 2 of the new ward boundaries, and it's not good enough answer for you to come here and say we're not ready.
No.
John.
I agree with the point that the Chair just made about the technical process and the time that is taking, but I feel that I need to make a point here. When we were looking at this as a call-in in January, we were all keen to address the practical issues, and I think that's the result of the recommendations that came forward. I think as a committee we were all keen to support concerns that were being raised. I'm not personally unhappy with a work in progress response, and appreciate sometimes these things can take time to get right, but what I would want to be clear is that I don't think as a committee we've at any time taken a strong view on, for instance, what it means to be local. And as someone who represents a ward where almost all of the important facilities used by the people in that ward are in other wards outside of it, I would very strongly stress that it's an item by item, location by location decision. Sometimes it's about a very local community, it's in the middle of a ward and there's 3 people and 1 organisation to be consulted. Sometimes it's on the edge of 3 wards and you may as well be talking to the whole community council. So I appreciate the technical difficulties that has gone through in sorting this process out. Personally, I'd rather we had a thorough process and got to the right answers, because I mean, I can't imagine a situation in which there would be large amounts of money being spent, for instance, on Lordship Lane. But in that case, I'd be wanting to have conversations with my colleagues in Dulwich Village and in Goose Green, because all of us would have residents who are strongly affected. So I think all of the questions of principle have been ironed out here, but I am interested in seeing that as it comes forward. I think other committee members have already expressed a desire to have it back. I don't feel as a committee we've decided what our view on, for instance, locality is.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. I'm really glad I came tonight because this is done it again. So this is a subject. Is that better? I'll shout. And this is a subject that's really close to my heart, both as I was a community council chair in the last council, and also Newington Ward, I think, has the 2nd or 3rd highest SIL amount. It's around £400,000, huge amount of development in my ward. It is literally in the shadow of all the development in Newcastle. People who live there probably have as much development around them as anyone else in London, potentially anyone else in the world. So, you know, a really quick bit of background, but we, on the advice of the previous cabinet member, on the advice of officers, we had a local ward conference, we got loads of local ideas from people, we put them all on the list. We were like, there's this money, you guys are living with all this development. You know, there's one estate where they have had a young person killed, they had an MP who was mugged, they were like, we need to do something about lighting, we're all this development around Elephant, and everyone's cutting through us to avoid the Walworth Road, and we've got to sort this out. To me, classic example of gross people being affected by that. They haven't been allocated anything by cabinet. I was talking to you about kind of, you know, what the thinking behind that was. So they're sort of sitting on this list. I really agree that there were problems with the process. It wasn't clear. It was different all over Southwark. It was a real battle to get clear criteria. So great that you're all looking at it, but those people who are sitting on this list being like, what's happening? We thought this was, you know, we were getting something from this development. We were kind of promised something by our local councillors, to be honest. You know, those people should really be treated well. They should be contacted. They should be updated. They've made a lot of effort to come to things like that conference to put in applications, and they should be kind of, you know, it's not their fault. They need to be treated well. And something else that I wonder if the committee could recommend is something that was really difficult to get in the last council was just a one-sided A4 that's like, this is what this money is, this is what you can spend it on, this is how to get it. It was, you know, we got long emails and different explanations depending whether you're looking at it from like a planning point of view or not. And I just really think that should be the aspiration, that you go to community meetings, community council, whatever, and you can give people a simple explanation of what it is, how they can apply for it, how they can benefit.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and as part of the process moving forward, making it as simple and understandable as possible is definitely going to be something that we will ensure is included in the paper going into cabinet, and happy to come when I come back update the scrutiny committee on that as well. In respect of the point that you raise, I can't understate. I can't overstate this enough, that the fact that I share that frustration in terms of the amount of community groups that I've spoken to, and I'm sure they would have spoken to you as well, but I've spoken to that have said, we played by the rules, we did everything we could, but it's just, why is these projects not being funded? And that's why one of the recommendations that did go to cabinet in December was saying, we recognise that you have done a lot of work, and how do we ensure that we're fast tracking that and re-looking at those organisations when it comes back to cabinet in May as well. So I think there does need to be, actually reflecting on this discussion, we do need to look at how we improve our communications with those organisations and see if we can go further. We've spoken to a number of those organisations, but how do we ensure we're speaking to all organisations and give that level of assurance that this is not something that's just been kicked down the road, and this is something that we are taking seriously, and we do want to work with them to ensure those projects are delivered. In terms of, John, your point very much highlights the reason for the need for flexibility, because it's recognising that what works in one part of the borough might not necessarily work in another, but having a structure around that as well. So not just having flexibility, because that can easily flow into chaos. So it's having flexibility managed by a structure, and a clear structure as well, which ties into the point that you were making, Eleanor, in terms of how is there a one-sided paper that's absolutely clear, everybody can reference and know this is what the seal process is moving forward. I appreciate everybody's frustration on this, and it's a frustration I share, but we will get there.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions to ask, I would recommend, as the current chair, that we place it on our work plan for the next municipal year. This is a classic bit of pre-scrutiny that we can do as a committee to look at what we mean as a committee, what locale means, what locality means, what are the clear definitions, a simple guide, how do people apply, and our opinion around rule boundaries. Yeah? Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry, Victor.
Chair, could I just clarify? So that piece of pre-scrutiny work that you're suggesting, will that be before a formal report goes to the cabinet?
When is your formal report going to
So
the cabinet?
my expectation, it's the first municipal meeting after, first meeting after the change of the municipal year.
After the 18th.
After the 18th of May, so it'll be the first meeting after that.
So that would be before the first task?
We won't have scrutiny until June. So, I mean,
because I'm just conscious of, one of the biggest frustration is delaying and not necessarily making a timely decision. Although I do want to ensure I'm coming back to us. So if I don't know how we get around this, if this is a written update, I don't know if there's an informal meeting. I'm happy to be flexible as to how we discuss and we look at this. It doesn't necessarily have to be as formal as needed, but it's up to you.
I think it's a necessity, and I'm guessing the members of this committee are saying it's a necessity for us to kick the process off before it goes to cabinet, so at least we're feeding into your report. Otherwise, I can see another calling on the horizon, which will delay things even further down the road. So I think our recommendation then is if you could delay your report to cabinet so that we can do a bit of pre-scrutiny, send those recommendations of pre-scrutiny to you, and then that informs your cabinet report
Chair,
Is
can I
that
just,
doable?
so I've just been looking at I've got the council calendar here, and that cabinet, which I'm assuming is the one you're talking about, is the 18th of June. And we've not got the date in front of us, but we think the first OSC is very early in the month, don't we? We usually try and get it on the kind of first Monday in June, so it's possible that this is just going to fall into place.
That is.
Is it 4th of June?
Tuesday.
Tuesday, okay.
You are right, 4th of June.
Yeah.
So actually,
That might work.
the plan does fall into place. So if I may not be the current chair, however, the committee is making a recommendation that they will discuss as part of their first item and part of their work programme in the June meeting, and then we'll send recommendations to you to inform your report to Cabinet.
I completely second that proposal, but could I just suggest then that if we are bringing this back to the 4th of June OSC, that it's the first item on the agenda as well, because I know, well, the first substantial item, because I know there are lots of members in the community that wanted to come and speak and be here for this discussion, and I think given how late it is, you know, it's what, 10 o'clock now, that is prohibitive to a lot of people.
Noted and agreed. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Okay, our next item is what's my agenda? Reducing health inequalities from council services and partner organisations. The chair of the Healthy Communities Scrutiny Commission.
Yeah, good evening. It's very late, and I'm sorry.
Barry, I am so sorry.
No, I'm sorry
it's
to
so
have you
late.
here this time and not bringing my report to you. But I wanted to thank you very much for putting it on the agenda and giving me the chance to advocate our report, the report of the Healthy Communities Scrutiny Commission. Why it's come tonight is because, for those who don't know, I'm sure there's some people, new councillors around here that might not know, what happens is that when a Scrutiny Commission produce a report, it normally has to go to OSC for them to become OSC to have a look at it. We did talk about it in the previous, earlier in the administrative year, that it would go direct, the scrutiny reports could go directly to Cabinet, but it turns out that that's not the way it needs to go. So I'm, with your indulgence, bringing it here tonight for us to ask any questions or give any suggestions that they'd like. So this report is about health inequalities, and it's something that we all know a little bit about, but I think it's something that doesn't get onto people's radar enough, because health inequalities means people have very considerable difference in life expectancy according to where they live. And not only that, and I think in a way it's kind of more of a concern, is that actually people have a much different healthy lifespan expectancy according to where they live. And that if people live in a poorer area, they're more likely to get ill, say in their 50s, than they are in their 70s, with multiple illnesses. Very, very life debilitating conditions. So what this report is trying to do, and is trying to help, obviously Public Health are doing loads on this already, and the Cabinet member and the Director for Public Health, they are very on this. But what this report sets out to do is to try and look at a way of working whereby we have partnership, multi-agency partnership, and a hands-on approach, whereby like Public Health are working out inside the community rather than making measurements and continual measurements, because we have lots and lots of data, but what we now need to do is to be actually out there working. And it's important that we work together with a local community when we're doing this, because behaviour change, and as that's what's required to get better public health, is behaviour change and communication with people, from their peers, in order to them to make those changes in their life choices so that they have longer and more fulfilling lives. So we've had 3 meetings now, and then where we've got to is that we have worked with one local estate in our borough, as almost like a model and as an exemplar. We couldn't put lots of resources in it, we're only doing it from a scrutiny position. But what we seek to do is open out the opportunities that could happen with this estate and with other estates across the borough in terms of a healthy communities approach, working with our residents associations and tenants associations. What I'm here for is we want this to go forward.